Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are unpacking the hidden macroeconomic forces that are quietly shaping our world. We're going to take some pretty dense academic models and translate them into the real-world engines of wealth and productivity. You know, we constantly hear about international trade on the news, right? But that conversation usually just stops at things like tariffs or supply chains or localized job impacts. Well, today, we're actually peering under the hood to see how trade rewires the very structure of a domestic economy right from the ground up. Okay, so let's just dive right into this by asking a really central question, one that totally challenges the conventional wisdom that trade is just about chasing cheaper foreign labor. What if the absolute most powerful thing trade does has literally nothing to do with finding cheaper workers, but everything to do with forcing local monopolies to actually play fair? Can simply opening borders fix deep, systemic distortions in how a market fundamentally functions? To answer that, we are grounding our entire explainer today in a landmark quantitative study published in the American Economic Review. This incredibly detailed research paper by Edmund, Midrigan, and Zhu essentially proves trade's hidden superpower. By building a rigorous mathematical model and then testing it against massive amounts of real-world data, they discovered that trade does way more than just move physical goods across borders. It actually fundamentally alters the competitive landscape of the domestic economy itself. Here is our quick roadmap for today. 1. The cost of high markups. 2. Trade as the equalizer. 3. We'll go inside the Taiwanese data. 4. The catch, symmetrical competition. And finally, 5. Measuring the true gains. All right, Section 1. The cost of high markups. Identifying the economic villain. Because to really understand why trade is so beneficial, we first need to understand the specific sickness it's curing. And the root of this sickness is something called the markup. Simply put, a markup is just the gap between a producer's marginal cost, meaning what it actually costs them to make one more unit of a good, and the price they eventually charge you, the consumer. Think of a dominant big fish in a small pond. When a single company totally dominates a domestic sector, they face very little legitimate competition. And because they lack that intense competitive pressure, they can artificially inflate prices well above what it actually costs to make the product. They secure these massive profit margins simply because, well, consumers have nowhere else to go. Which leads us to the real damage, misallocation. Misallocation happens when these variable, artificially inflated markups cause vital resources, things like labor, materials, and capital investment, to be distributed super inefficiently across the wider economy. Because different companies have varying degrees of market power, they charge wildly different markups. And what that means is relative prices are no longer aligned with relative marginal costs. The crucial pricing signals in the economy just get completely scrambled, and resources stop flowing to their most natural, efficient uses. This misallocation has a devastating real-world impact. It directly lowers our aggregate productivity. When an economy is operating with scrambled price signals and valuable resources are basically held hostage by local monopolies, the whole system just runs sluggishly. It essentially puts a hard ceiling on a country's total factor productivity. And ultimately, this unseen friction dictates exactly how rich, innovative, and efficient our entire society can be, seriously dragging down the baseline standard of living. Moving on to Section 2, trade as the equalizer, the unexpected cure. So if these local monopolies and their bloated markups are choking our productivity, how exactly does international trade fix it? Consider the contrast between two totally different worlds. Economists use this term autarky to describe a completely closed economy, one with absolutely zero international trade. Now, an autarky naturally breeds pure monopolies and exceptionally high markups, because those domestic giants are completely protected from outside threats. But an open economy completely changes the underlying math. It inherently shrinks the market shares of those dominant domestic producers by introducing hungry, ambitious outside players. Here's how the mechanics of this cure actually play out. By exposing that big fish to the vast ocean of foreign competitors, their market power shrinks immediately. They can't charge a massive premium anymore because consumers can just pivot and buy the imported alternative instead. So these dominant producers are literally forced to drop their markups just to stay competitive. And as those markups compress and equalize across the board, the misallocation illness is cured. Prices realign with actual costs, and resources organically shift back to where they are most useful. Okay, Section 3. Inside the Taiwanese data, a real-world clinical trial. To prove this isn't just some neat whiteboard theory, researchers looked at incredibly detailed 7-digit manufacturing data from Taiwan. This exceptionally granular data lets us look at individual products and the specific firms making them. The researchers really needed to measure the actual extent of misallocation out in the real world, because obviously, if there's no misallocation to begin with, there's nothing for trade to fix. And what they found in Taiwan's domestic sales data was staggering market concentration. The manufacturing landscape definitely wasn't made up of thousands of equal-sized competitors happily fighting for market share. Check this out. The crucial point is this single number. Within a given sector, the single largest producer accounts for a massive 46% of that sector's domestic sales. Imagine looking at hundreds of different manufacturing categories, and time again, one single corporate giant is eating up nearly half the market all by itself. It's wild. And honestly, it gets even more extreme when we zoom out and look at the economy as a whole. Just the top 1% of producers account for 41% of all sales across the board. A tiny, elite handful of giants are completely dominating the pond. This fat-tailed distribution means that market power is incredibly concentrated in just a very few hands. As the researchers explicitly noted, the overall pattern that emerges is consistently one of very strong concentration. Interpreted through the lens of our economic model, this intense concentration means there is a massive amount of misallocation just waiting to be fixed. These dominant firms have the structural power to charge huge markups, scrambling the economy's efficiency. The stage is perfectly set for international trade to step in and do its work. Which brings us to Section 4, the catch, symmetrical competition. Now you might be thinking, great, we just open the borders and everything is instantly fixed. Well, not quite. Trade can save the economy, but only under very specific conditions. Trade only reduces these markup distortions if the foreign producers entering the market have relatively similar levels of productivity to the domestic giants. You absolutely need a setup that creates genuine, fierce, head-to-head competition. The foreign big fish essentially has to be roughly the same size and strength as the domestic big fish. Because think about the alternative counterfactual here. If we open the borders and the foreign firms are just vastly more productive than the local ones, they don't create healthy competition at all. They just come in, completely wipe out the local producers, and become the new monopolies. If that happens, markup dispersion actually increases and the misallocation problem gets significantly worse. So under the wrong conditions, the pro-competitive gains from trade could theoretically be completely negative. Thankfully, when looking at the global data, the researchers found a very high cross-country correlation in productivity, about 0.94. This basically means that, by and large, countries operating in the global market have similar technological capabilities in similar sectors. As a result, a massive 45% of trade in this model is what's called intra-industry. This just means countries are trading similar goods with each other, resulting in exactly the kind of fierce head-to-head competition, like, say, Ford competing directly with Volkswagen, that naturally forces markups down. All right, bringing it home with Section 5, measuring the true gains, the final macroeconomic score. We know the sickness, we know the cure, and we know the required conditions. Let's finally measure exactly how much richer this pro-competitive effect actually makes the economy. The victory of open markets is incredibly clear in the numbers. Under a closed autarky, the misallocation caused by those unchecked domestic monopolies results in a 9.0% total loss in the economy's potential productivity. But by opening up to international trade at Taiwan's historical levels, that loss naturally shrinks to 7.0%. Trade is literally recapturing a massive chunk of lost economic potential simply by forcing firms to fiercely compete, thereby lowering those damaging markup distortions. And when you take that exact reduction in misallocation, those pro-competitive gains, and you combine them with the standard traditional benefits of international trade, like comparative advantage, the results are genuinely staggering. Aggregate productivity jumps a massive 12.4% compared to a completely closed economy. That is a transformative generational increase in a society's wealth, efficiency, and overall standard of living, driven in large part by quietly breaking the pricing power of local monopolies. So I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought to ponder. We often instinctively look to the government to solve corporate dominance and pricing power, right? But why spend decades writing, debating, and enforcing complex, highly bureaucratic anti-monopoly laws when simply opening our borders to international trade might naturally do the heavy lifting for us? It turns out the most effective trust buster isn't always a domestic regulator. Sometimes it's just a highly motivated competitor from across the ocean. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning how the invisible engines of our world really work.